Eleanor Briggs, 67 years old, drove north on Route 10 through 2 feet of February snow, with everything she owned loaded into a 1998 Honda Civic that had 211,000 miles on it and a crack running diagonally across the lower left corner of the windshield. The crack had been there for 3 years. She had never gotten around to fixing it. There had always been something else, a dinner party to organize, a grandchild's recital, something Douglas needed. In 39 years of marriage, there had always been something Douglas needed more than Eleanor needed a windshield. She had $487.33 in her checking account. She had a cashier's check for $1,200 in her purse, which was the first monthly installment of the spousal support that would arrive like a small hollow apology for the next 23 months. After that, nothing. Martin Holt, Douglas's attorney, had made sure of that. He had been very precise about the mathematics of discarding a woman after 39 years. In the back seat, stacked in milk crates and tied with bungee cords, were her winter clothes, her teaching certificates going back to 1978, a box of paperback novels, a cast-iron skillet her mother had given her in 1987, and a wedding photo she had not been able to leave behind, though she still wasn't sure why. Douglas was smiling in it. She was smiling too. Neither one of them had known at 28 what kind of man he would eventually choose to become. On the passenger seat, printed from the county assessor's website and folded in thirds, was the deed to 3.1 acres in Haverhill, New Hampshire, containing a 1971 Ford school bus that had been her father's and that no one, including Eleanor, had visited in 14 years. Douglas had called it that yellow eyesore. He had said it at the settlement hearing, in front of Judge Patricia Elwood, with the mild contempt of a man swatting away a fly. He had let her keep it the way you let someone keep a joke that was never funny. Martin Holt had barely written it down. What Douglas didn't know, what he was too certain of himself to consider even for a moment, was that her father Arthur had been a very deliberate man, a patient man, a man who believed that certain things should be kept safe until the person who needed them was finally ready to receive them. And Eleanor Briggs was ready now. If this is the kind of story you've been needing, stay with me. Because what Eleanor found inside that bus on a Tuesday morning in February, after a night of sleeping in her car with the engine running and the heat on low to save gas, is going to change the way you think about what people throw away. Subscribe to Dreams Don't Age if you haven't already. We tell stories about people who were counted out. We have never once been wrong about them. Welcome. Arthur Briggs had come back from Korea in the spring of 1954 with a bad knee, a serious disposition, and an absolute conviction that land was the only thing that didn't lie to you. He had grown up in Haverhill in Grafton County, in a house that his own father had built with quarried stone and stubbornness, and he had carried that place inside him through 2 years of a war that had no intention of being reasonable. When he came home, the first thing he did, before he found work, before he courted Eleanor's mother, before he did anything else, was walk the property line of 1847 Old River Road and confirm that it was still there. It was. He raised Eleanor in that house. There were 2 bedrooms and a wood stove and a garden out back, where he grew pole beans and butternut squash and taught Eleanor the names of things before she could read them in books. He drove a school bus for Haverhill Cooperative School District for 26 years, and when he retired in 1983, the district gave him a dinner at the Grange Hall and a plaque that said, "Service above self," which Arthur found a little much. He had driven children to school because children needed to get to school. It hadn't seemed heroic to him. He kept the bus. The district sold their old buses at auction, and Arthur bought back his own 1971 Ford for $400 and drove it home to Old River Road and parked it at the back of the property near the tree line, and that was that. He kept it painted. He kept the engine serviceable. When Eleanor asked him why, he said a bus that size was worth keeping. She had assumed he meant practically. She had not understood back then that her father almost never said one thing when he meant something else entirely. Eleanor had grown up reading under that bus's dash light on evenings when her father did paperwork at the wheel. She had grown up knowing the smell of it, diesel and old vinyl, and the particular dusty warmth of a vehicle that had carried 1,000 children and absorbed their energy into its bones. She had loved that bus the way you love the things that were present at the beginning of who you are. And then she had met Douglas Briggs. It was 1983. Eleanor was 27, completing her master's degree in English education at Plymouth State, and Douglas was 30, working at his family's landscaping supply business outside Concord, handsome in a way that was almost architectural, broad shoulders, a certainty in his movements that read at the time as confidence rather than entitlement. He was funny when he chose to be. He was attentive enough to make a 27-year-old woman feel chosen. They married in October 1984 in a small ceremony in Haverhill at the Congregational Church where Arthur had attended for 40 years. Eleanor wore her mother's veil. Arthur walked her down the aisle with his bad knee and didn't complain about it once. She began teaching 7th grade English at Merrimack Valley Middle School the following September. She loved it the way she had loved reading as a child, deeply, without hesitation, with the particular joy of someone who has found the exact thing they were meant to do. She was good at it. Her students came back years later to tell her so. Clifford and Joanne were born in 1980 and 1983, Douglas's children from a brief first marriage that he referred to as a mistake, and Eleanor raised them the way she raised her students, with patience and consistency and a private hope that love, applied steadily enough, would eventually take root. Clifford and Joanne had never called her Mom. They had called her Eleanor, and she had accepted that. And she had cut their sandwiches diagonally because Joanne had once mentioned she preferred it that way, and she had attended every school play and soccer game and graduation, and she had done it all without being asked. It was Douglas who had asked her to leave teaching. It was 2001. Clifford was married, Joanne was in college, and Douglas's landscaping business had expanded to 4 locations, and the accounting had become complicated. He needed someone he trusted. He framed it as a partnership. Eleanor had handed in her resignation at the end of the 2002 school year after 17 years in the classroom, and she had never stood in front of a class again. "You can always go back," Douglas had said. She had believed him. In 2008, when the recession hit and the business needed cash, Eleanor had contributed $43,000 from her retirement account, money she had accumulated over 17 years of teaching, the kind of money that doesn't come back easily. She had signed the paperwork without reading it carefully, the way you sign things for someone you have pledged your life to. She was not the only one who had pledged something. She had simply been the only one who kept the pledge. The first time she heard the name Vanessa Colton, she was standing in the kitchen of their house on Pembroke Drive in Concord, cutting the herbs from the garden bed she maintained along the south wall, and she was cutting them because Douglas had mentioned he'd like roasted chicken that night. She heard the name on his phone, left face up on the counter, a text preview she was not meant to see. She set down the scissors. She stood very still for a moment. Then she finished cutting the herbs, because the chicken still needed to be made, and because Eleanor Briggs had spent 39 years finishing what she started. She had not confronted him that night. She had not confronted him for 3 more months, and by the time she did in February of 2022, Douglas already had an attorney, Martin Holt, 57, of Holt & Greer in Concord, who spoke to Eleanor across a conference table with the careful precision of someone explaining to a child why the dog had to go to a farm. The divorce was finalized on November 9th, 2022. It had taken 9 months. Douglas kept the house, $618,000 recently appraised, the business valued conservatively at $340,000, the joint investment accounts totaling $127,400, and the savings $184,300. Eleanor had walked into that marriage with her teaching pension and a bus on a piece of land in Haverhill, and that was more or less what she walked out with. The pension had been cashed out in 2008. The spousal support was $1,200 a month for 24 months. Martin Holt had not blinked when he read the numbers aloud. The day of the final hearing, the conference room was very cold. November light came through the windows at a low angle and fell across the table in thin strips. Martin Holt sat beside Douglas. Eleanor's attorney, a woman named Gloria Reyes, who had done her best with very little time to prepare, sat beside Eleanor and touched her arm once, briefly, in a way that meant, "Hold on." Douglas wore his blue jacket, the one Eleanor had pressed so many times she knew the texture of its lapel by heart. He was not cruel at the table. He was something worse than cruel. He was indifferent, the way a man is indifferent when he has already completed his calculations and closed the ledger and moved on. Martin Holt read the settlement aloud, item by item, with the composure of a man reading a grocery list. The house, the accounts, the business, the savings, Eleanor's spousal support. "The Haverhill property," Martin Holt said, and paused to glance down at his notes with faint distaste. 3-1 acres, 1847 Old River Road, containing a 1971 Ford school bus, non-operational. Assessed value $9,400. This will remain with Mrs. Briggs. Douglas made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "She can have that," he said. "I'm not going to fight anyone for a bus that doesn't run." He turned to Clifford, who was seated behind him along the wall, and Clifford allowed himself a small, cooperative smile. Martin Holt said nothing. Gloria Reyes looked at her hands. Eleanor looked at Douglas. She looked at him for a long moment, at the line of his jaw, at the way he sat back in his chair with his ankle crossed over his knee, at the absolute ease of a man who had never in his life considered the possibility that he could be wrong about anything. She did not say a word. She signed where she was told to sign. She stood when it was time to stand. She shook Gloria Reyes's hand and thanked her. She walked past Douglas without looking at him. She walked out of the building into the November air, which was sharp and thin in her lungs, and she walked to her car, and she sat in it with the doors closed and the engine off. She cried for 23 minutes, not the quiet kind, the kind that comes up from somewhere ancient, from 39 years of mended things and unsaid things and dinners she made and dreams she postponed and a retirement account she had handed over without reading the paperwork. She cried until there was nothing left in her chest but a hollow place. And then she sat for a while with her hands on the wheel and her forehead against the back of her hands, and she breathed. Then she started the car. She had exactly 48 hours remaining in the Concord house, and she needed to use them. What followed was 30 days that Eleanor would later describe, if she described them at all, simply as the waiting. She had moved into the extended stay motel on Fort Eddy Road, $62 a night, which was eating through the first spousal support check faster than she could calculate, and she had tried to organize what she knew. She had $487.33 in checking. She had the Honda. She had the 3.1 acres in Haverhill with the bus on them, which the county assessor had valued at $9,400 and which she had not visited since the summer of 2009, when she and her father had gone up for the 4th of July weekend and eaten potato salad on the ground beside the bus and listened to the Beaver Creek run over the stones. Arthur had died in March 2010. She had not been back since. There were nights in that motel room when she lay awake and did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was always the same, $1,200 a month for 24 months, $17 a day, then nothing. Her Social Security at 67 would come to $1,087 a month, with no rent, no utility bills. If she could get the bus habitable, if the property had water, if the wood stove Arthur had installed was still functional, she might be able to survive. Not comfortably. Not in any way Douglas would have recognized as living, but she might be able to survive. She made the call to the Haverhill town clerk on a Thursday morning, pulling her coat tight in the motel parking lot because the heating unit in her room had started making a noise like a small animal in distress. The clerk told her the property taxes were current. Arthur had established an automatic payment from an account Eleanor didn't know existed, and the payments had continued after his death, drawn against what balance remained. He wasn't sure what balance remained. She'd need to contact the bank. Eleanor wrote down the bank name on the back of the settlement document. She stared at it for a while. On the Tuesday before she left, 6 weeks after the hearing, the motel room money almost gone, she drove past the house on Pembroke Drive at 7 in the morning, not entirely sure why. The lights in the kitchen were on. There was a second car in the driveway, small and red. Eleanor sat at the stop sign for longer than was strictly necessary. Then she turned north. She had heard Clifford tell Joanne in the hallway of the courthouse, in the too casual voice of a son trying to avoid accountability, that the house was going to be renovated, that Douglas was going to open it up, take down the kitchen wall, update everything. Eleanor had listened from around the corner and thought, I planted every herb in that garden. I chose every light fixture. I stripped and refinished those floors myself over 3 weekends in the fall of 2007, on my hands and knees, because Douglas had said a professional would cost too much. She did not go back to look at the house again. She arrived at 1847 Old River Road on February 14, 2023, at 2:17 in the afternoon, which she noted without irony. The last 11 miles had taken her 40 minutes. Route 10 was ploughed and passable, but the county road that led from it to the property was not, and the Honda had no business on it. The Civic lurched and slid on packed snow over ruts that the last freeze had turned to ridges of dirty ice, and Eleanor drove in first gear with both hands rigid on the wheel and her jaw set. The GPS on her phone, balanced on the dashboard, said, in its pleasant and completely untroubled voice, "You have arrived at your destination," when there was nothing visible but tree line and a gap in the snowfield that might have been a driveway. She sat in the car for a long time. Steam came off the hood. The temperature outside was 8 degrees Fahrenheit. Through the windshield crack, cold air came in thin and steady like a small blade. She got out. The property was white. That was the first thing. Absolute white, broken only by the dark line of bare birch trees along the property's east edge, and the grey strip of Beaver Creek 40 yards beyond, mostly frozen, a seam of black water showing through the ice at its centre. The spruce trees her father had planted along the north side had grown enormous. They stood maybe 30 feet tall now, their branches loaded with snow, enormous and silent, like a wall the world had built around the place while no one was watching. And there at the back of the property, half swallowed by a snowdrift on its north side, the roof just visible above the white, the bus. It was yellow, faded now, the colour of old butter or dry grass in October, but unmistakably yellow. And the shape of it, the flat front, the low roof line, the row of windows along the side, came up from some deep place in Eleanor's memory and struck her in a way she hadn't expected. She stood in the snow in her good boots, which were not made for snow, and looked at it. The spruce trees blocked most of the wind here. The quiet was complete. A chickadee called once from somewhere to her left, the two-note drop of it falling clean through the cold air, and then the quiet came back. She walked toward the bus. The door was frozen shut. She had to work the handle with both hands for 2 full minutes before it gave, and the sound it made opening was a long metallic groan that travelled out across the snowfield and disappeared into the trees. She stepped up. The cold inside the bus was the same as the cold outside, but different. It had a stillness to it, a depth, the cold of an enclosed space that had not been warmed in years. The vinyl seats were cracked along their seams, the cracks webbed like old porcelain, and the floor was filled with dust that the cold had crystallized into something closer to frost. The dash was intact. The steering wheel was there, enormous and real, the way she remembered it. At the back, her father had installed a narrow wood stove sometime in the late 1980s, vented through the rear window with a short stovepipe. Beside it, a single wooden shelf held 3 folded wool blankets, a box of waterproof matches, and 2 cans of soup. She stood looking at the soup cans for a long moment. They were chicken and rice, her favorite. Arthur had known she'd be cold when she arrived. He had always known the things she needed before she said them. There was wood under the bus, she found, a half cord, split and stacked on pallets to keep it off the ground, wrapped in a tarp that Arthur had secured with bungee cords, and that the years had weathered grey but not destroyed. She brought in 4 pieces and started a fire. The stove was functional. The pipe drew. Within 20 minutes, the back of the bus was warm enough that she could take off her gloves. She ate the soup cold from the can, sitting on the back bench with a wool blanket around her shoulders, and she watched the light change on the snowfield outside the bus windows as the afternoon went west, and the shadows of the spruce trees stretched long and blue across the white. She did not cry. She was too tired to cry, and too cold, and too aware that crying would not cut firewood. She was alive. The bus was standing. The wood stove worked. That was enough for tonight. The next morning, at first light, she began. What Eleanor accomplished in the first 30 days was not heroic in any way that made noise. It was the kind of work that gets done by someone who has decided that the alternative is not an option. The first week was survival. She had $487.33 and a list. She drove the 12 miles to Haverhill town centre, the Honda slipping on the back road until she learned to feel for the ruts beneath the snow and steer through them rather than against them. And she walked into Ouellet's general store on Court Street, which had a hand-lettered sign in the window that said Est, 1971 in green paint, and she bought a bag of rice, a bag of dried beans, a box of oatmeal, 2 dozen eggs, a block of cheddar, and a bottle of propane for the camping stove she'd found folded behind the driver's seat. She spent $41.87. The woman behind the counter was perhaps 69, with white hair pinned in a loose knot and the comfortable authority of someone who had run the same register for decades. Her name tag said Betty. "You new to the area?" Betty Wellett asked, looking at Eleanor's purchase distribution with the mild attention of someone who reads a shopping cart the way a doctor reads a chart. "I'm on the Briggs property," Eleanor said. "Old River Road. My father's land." Betty looked at her for a moment. "Arthur's girl?" Eleanor nodded. Betty Ouellet put the propane in the bag herself and did not charge her for it. "Your daddy used to come in every Tuesday," she said. "Bought the same things for 30 years. Oatmeal, dried beans, 2 cans of sardines." She paused. "He talked about you." Eleanor paid for the groceries and drove back to the property. She sat in the Honda for a moment. Then she went inside and made oatmeal on the camping stove and ate it standing up because there was work to do. By the end of the first week, she had cleared the snow from the bus roof, which had been carrying perhaps 400 pounds of it, and which she addressed with a roof rake borrowed from George Pelletier, 73, who farmed the 40-acre parcel adjoining the north edge of her property, and who appeared on her 3rd morning with the rake over his shoulder and a laconic French-Canadian nod that served as both introduction and welcome. He helped her without being asked and left without being thanked, which was, she would learn, exactly his way. His full name was Georges-André Pelletier, and he had been born outside Quebec City and had farmed this land for 31 years, and he spoke in short declarative sentences that contained no unnecessary words. "Roof," he said, on that 3rd morning, pointing at the ice load above the rear windows. "I know," Eleanor said. "Rake's in my barn," he said. "Thank you," she said. He had nodded and walked back across the field. By the end of the second week, Eleanor had insulated the bus floor with plywood and the wool rugs she had ordered online. 47 €, shipped to the general store because she had no address that would accept packages, and had sealed the cracked window seams with expanding foam that George had left in a bag outside her door with no note. The Coleman lantern she'd found in the storage compartment under the bus lit the interior to something that was almost warm in feeling, if not always in temperature. She slept on the back bench, which she had padded with the seat cushions removed from the first 3 rows, and she slept hard, the way she had not slept in 39 years, asleep without one ear listening for what Douglas might need, without the low-grade alertness of a woman who has organized her rest around someone else's requirements. She woke before light and made coffee on the camping stove and stood in the door of the bus in the dark, wrapped in her coat, and watched the snow. The chickadees came back every morning to the spruce trees. There were 4 of them, and after the first week she began to recognize them as individuals by the small particular differences in their movement. She did not call Clifford. She did not call Joanne. Joanne had sent 3 texts in the first week after the hearing. "Just checking in. Let me know if you need anything. Hope you're okay." Messages written by someone who wanted to have written them without having to follow up. Eleanor had read them and put her phone face down and not replied. She had one person she called once a week on Sunday evenings, Gloria Reyes, her attorney, who was still working on a detail of the settlement that had snagged on a question about the Haverhill property's correct acreage. The county records showed 3.1 acres. Gloria had found, in the Grafton County Registry of Deeds, a notation referring to a survey amendment from 1992 that had never been formally registered. She was trying to locate the original survey document. "It may be nothing," Gloria told her. "Look anyway," Eleanor said. The dog showed up on a Wednesday in the 3rd week, which was also the day Eleanor cut herself on the edge of a metal cabinet she was clearing from the back of the bus, a clean slice across the heel of her right hand that bled with startling enthusiasm and had to be wrapped in a clean T-shirt until she could drive to the Hanover pharmacy for butterfly closures. She was sitting in the driver's seat with her hand elevated, waiting for the bleeding to slow when she heard a sound at the door. It was a dog. Medium-sized, some kind of hound mix with large paws and a serious expression, and ribs she could count. He sat in the snow and looked at the door of the bus, and then at Eleanor. He had been out in the weather for some time. His coat was matted along his back, and his paws were packed with ice between the toes. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about her situation. Then she opened the door. He stepped up carefully, assessed the interior with a single slow sweep of his gaze, chose the 3rd seat from the front, and lay down. He did not ask permission. He had not been lost. He had made a decision. Eleanor decided to call him Cooper for no particular reason other than it suited his bearing. George, who came by the following morning and found the dog, said only, "Hound," in a tone that meant, "Yes, that makes sense." By the beginning of the 2nd month, Eleanor had established a routine that she followed with the precision of a woman who knows that routine is what keeps you from thinking too much. She woke at 5:15. Coffee. Cooper's walk along the creek trail, half a mile east to the stone wall that marked the property's official edge, half a mile back. Fire-fed, oatmeal or eggs, then work. She was rebuilding the interior. She had watched on her phone 11 different YouTube videos about bus conversions, because it turned out that there was an entire world of people who lived in school buses, who had thought carefully about insulation and ventilation and water storage and composting, and who were extraordinarily willing to explain what they knew. She had written their advice in a spiral notebook she kept on the dash. She made mistakes. She bought the wrong size pipe fittings for the water line she was attempting to run from the hand pump Arthur had installed beside the bus and had to drive back to Haverhill twice. She mismeasured the plywood for the sleeping platform by ½ an inch and had to trim it by hand with the handsaw she borrowed from George, who watched her first 2 cuts without comment and then simply took the saw and did the cut himself, handed it back, and went home. She accepted this without embarrassment. She was learning. Betty Ouellet gave her a neighbour discount she had invented on the spot, which reduced Eleanor's grocery bill by 11% every visit, and which Betty never announced or explained. She simply charged it and moved on. One night, toward the end of the 2nd month, Eleanor woke at 2 in the morning to a wind that had come off the White Mountains and was hitting the bus broadside with enough force to flex the walls. The stovepipe rattled. Something in the spruce trees cracked. Cooper lifted his head from the end of the sleeping platform and looked at her with calm brown eyes, and she put her hand on him, and the warmth of his coat under her palm was a specific and real comfort in the dark. She thought in that moment about the herb garden on Pembroke Drive, the sage and the flat-leaf parsley, and the rosemary she had coaxed through 3 New Hampshire winters in a pot brought inside each November. She thought about the floors she had refinished. She thought about 17 years of 7th graders who had learned to love a paragraph. Burden, Douglas had said. Not at the settlement table. He had not said it there. He had said it 6 months before the papers were filed in the kitchen, when she had asked carefully whether everything was all right between them, and he had set down his coffee and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has finally decided to put it down. "You've become a burden, Eleanor," he said. "I need you to understand that. This has become a burden to me." She had not answered. She had carried those words for 6 months before the papers arrived. She lay in the bus now, in the dark, with the wind pressing the walls, and she thought about that word. She let herself think about it fully, the way you have to lance something before it heals. And then she turned over and pulled the blanket up and went back to sleep. It was George, on a grey Thursday morning in the middle of the 2nd month, who said the thing she needed to hear. He had come to help her level the sleeping platform. It had a 3-degree pitch that had been rolling her east during the night, and when they had finished and stood back to look at it, he said without prelude or sentiment, "You know, people said you'd be gone before Christmas." He paused, hands in his coat pockets. "Not me. But people said." Eleanor looked at him. "You're actually doing it," he said, and went home. She stood for a moment in the bus. Then she laughed, a real laugh, not the kind produced for someone else's comfort, but the private kind, the kind that comes from somewhere surprising. Cooper looked up from his spot by the stove. Outside, through the window, a pair of chickadees landed on the spruce branch nearest the bus and sat there, 4 inches apart, in the grey morning light. She made coffee. She felt something she had not felt in a long time. She thought, this is what hope feels like when it comes back quietly, without making a production of itself. It happened on the 43rd day, a Tuesday in late March, when the first thaw had turned the snowfield to a crust of grey ice over soft mud, and the creek was running loud with melt. Eleanor was cleaning the driver's area, removing the last accumulation of years from the dashboard, wiping down the console, checking whether the defroster switch still moved. She had her hand under the dash, clearing debris from a corner that her cloth couldn't reach, when her fingers found something that should not have been there. Not debris, an edge, a panel edge, flush with the surrounding surface, with a small notch cut into it at one end, the kind of notch a thumb could fit into. Eleanor stopped. She pulled out her hand and looked at it. Then she got the lantern and held it under the dash. The panel was approximately 12 inches by 8, cut from the same metal as the surrounding dash, painted the same dark green and invisible if you were not touching it. The notch was deliberate. Someone had made this. She pressed her thumb into the notch and pulled. The panel swung out on two small hinges. Behind it was a cavity, perhaps 4 inches deep, and inside the cavity was a tin box, the kind that had once held Danish butter cookies, with a blue and white lid and a thin film of old grease around its seal. The lid was held shut by a single rubber band that, when Eleanor touched it, crumbled and fell away in pieces. She sat down on the driver's seat. Cooper stood up from the back and came forward and sat beside her left knee. She held the tin box on her lap and did not open it for a long moment. Arthur Briggs had put it there. She did not know this yet as a fact, but she knew it the way you know some things before the evidence confirms them, in the place where the body understands what the mind hasn't caught up to yet. She opened the box. Inside, wrapped in a piece of waxed linen and held flat by a rubber band that had survived better than the one on the lid, were 4 documents. A letter written by hand, a folded legal document, official with a notary seal, a survey map clearly old with dates and measurements marked in pencil, and a passbook, an old-fashioned bank savings passbook, navy blue, from the Grafton County Savings Bank, with her name written on the inside cover in her father's handwriting, Eleanor Margaret Briggs, sole beneficiary. She unfolded the letter first. It was dated July 4th, 1991. The handwriting was her father's, small even, the letters formed with the care of a man who took penmanship seriously. "Dear Ellie," it began, "if you're reading this, something has finally cracked open the way it needed to." She read it slowly in the cold cab of the bus, with the creek running outside and Cooper's warm weight against her leg. Her father had written, with the careful precision of a man who had thought it through for years, that he had never trusted Douglas Briggs with the things that mattered most, and that the older he got, the less he had trusted him with anything. He had written that he had known Eleanor long before she was someone's wife, had known her as someone who read under a dashboard by lantern light and named the chickadees and could identify 11 species of fern in the woods along Beaver Creek. And that person, he wrote, was the person this land was meant for. He had written that he kept the bus ugly on purpose. He had written that Douglas would never fight for anything he thought was worthless. He had written, "I'm sorry it took what it probably took for you to get here. But I am not sorry you're there now. This place has been waiting for you for a long time." He had signed it, "Love, Dad." July 4th, 1991. Eleanor sat with the letter for a long time. Then she picked up the survey document. It was dated 1992, prepared by a licensed surveyor named Peter Mallory of Woodsville, and it described the corrected boundaries of the property at 1847 Old River Road, Haverhill, NH. The correction, carefully notated, changed the total acreage from 3.1 to 8.7 acres. The additional 5.6 acres extended south along the creek, covering a section of land that included a cluster of stones half buried in the bank of Beaver Creek, which the survey noted in small annotated text as possible remnants of a pre-revolutionary mill foundation, circa 1743, in accordance with historical notation referenced in the Grafton County Registry Addendum of same date. She put the survey down and picked up the legal document. It was a codicil to Arthur's will, notarized in November 2009, 4 months before he died, and witnessed by 2 parties, both of whom had signed with legible names. It named Eleanor Margaret Briggs as sole heir to the real property at 1847 Old River Road, Haverhill, NH, explicitly including all mineral rights, water rights, easements, and historical designations, and it named the Grafton County Savings Bank as the institution holding funds in her name for said property's upkeep, said funds totaling, as of the notarization date, $87,400. She opened the passbook. Last entry, November 14th, 2009. Balance, 87C400, Zales. Eleanor set the passbook on her knee. She looked at the survey. She looked at the letter. She looked out the windshield at the property, at the 8.7 acres of it, the spruce trees, the creek she could hear running, the stone wall at the far edge, the stones in the creek bank that had been there since 1743. Then she cried. Not the hollow kind, the kind from the courthouse parking lot. This was a different kind of crying, the kind that comes when something you had given up on turns out not to be gone, the kind that comes when the person who knew you best leaves you a message in a tin box under a dashboard, and the message says, "I saw you, I kept this for you. You were worth keeping." Cooper put his head in her lap. She called Gloria Reyes that evening from the driver's seat of the bus, with the lantern on and a fire burning in the stove, and read her the documents item by item. Gloria was quiet for a long time after the survey. "Eleanor," Gloria said, "the 1992 survey amendment. I've been looking for that." "It was in the bus," Eleanor said. "Do you understand what the Mill Foundation means? If it's pre-revolutionary and the land has historical designation, the property may qualify for the New Hampshire Heritage Conservation Program. Conservation easements on a property like that." Gloria paused. "We're talking about annual payments, potentially $14,600 a year or more, depending on the designation level, and it protects the land in perpetuity." "And the $80,400, Eleanor asked. "That's yours," Gloria said. "Accounts in your name. The bank will need the death certificate and the codicil, but that's a straightforward beneficiary claim. That money never passed through the estate. Douglas's attorneys would not have had visibility of it." Eleanor looked at the survey in her hands. "He kept it ugly on purpose," she said. "I'm sorry?" "My father. He kept the property looking worthless on purpose, so no one would fight for it." Gloria was quiet for a moment. "I'd say it worked," she said. 2 weeks later, Eleanor drove to Hanover to meet with Sam Whitfield, 46, the Grafton County historian, who had been recommended by Betty Ouellet with the same casual certainty with which Betty recommended everything. Sam was a compact, precise man who arrived at the Hanover coffee shop with a canvas bag of reference materials and immediately ordered the largest coffee on the menu. He examined the survey, the letter, and the photographs of the creek bank stones that Eleanor had taken on her phone, and he was very still for a long time. "Those are cut stones," he said, pointing to one of the photographs. "That notching pattern, do you see that? That's not natural. That's a mill race channel." He looked up. "The 1743 date is consistent with everything I know about the Haverhill Mills. There was a grist mill operation on the Upper Beaver Creek, referenced in the county records, that disappeared from documentation around 1760, assumed lost to flooding. If this is that foundation—" He stopped. "Do you understand what you found?" "My father found it," Eleanor said. "I just opened the box. The New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources will want to do a full survey," Sam said. "If it's confirmed, the property becomes a documented historical site. That changes the conservation designation. That changes the value." He paused. "Significantly." He was right. The full appraisal, completed in June 2023, valued the 8.7-acre property at $487,000, accounting for the historical designation, the water rights, and the conservation easement that the New Hampshire Heritage Program confirmed Eleanor was eligible for. The annual conservation payment, beginning in the first year, was $16,200. The $87,400 in the Grafton County Savings Bank account, plus 14 years of compounded interest, came to $94,380. Eleanor sat in the bus with the appraisal documents in her lap and Cooper beside her and the creek running outside in the June morning, and thought about a man who had bought a school bus for $400 in 1983 and kept it painted and kept the engine serviceable and cut a notch in a panel under the dash and put a tin box behind it and waited 33 years for his daughter to come home. It was a Saturday in July when the white SUV appeared at the end of the property road, a Mercedes GLS, Concord plates, moving carefully over the ruts that Eleanor now navigated without thinking. She was outside, replacing a section of the south fence line with George, who had come over with post and wire and his usual wordless competence, and she saw it coming and set down the post driver and watched. Douglas parked at the edge of the cleared area. He got out first, in a jacket she didn't recognize, new, expensive, the kind of thing Vanessa would have chosen. Clifford got out from the passenger side, looking at his phone until the last possible moment. They walked toward her across the dry summer grass, and she watched them come with the same quality of attention she had given the survey documents, clear, unhurried, without anticipation. George leaned on the fence post and did not leave. "Eleanor," Douglas said. The word came out with the warmth he was capable of producing when he needed it. "We've been worried about you. We wanted to see how you were getting on." Eleanor looked at him. He had aged in 8 months in the way that men age when the life they constructed around someone else's management begins to show its underlying structure. There were things undone around him. She could see it. "How did you hear?" she asked. Clifford glanced up from his phone, then back down. Douglas smiled in the careful way. "Small town," he said. "Word gets around." He looked past her at the bus, the fence, the repaired water line running along the south wall. "You've been busy." The word busy carried in it, just barely audible, an amazement that she had managed anything at all. "I have," Eleanor said. "We heard there might be some kind of historical designation," Douglas said. He kept his voice casual, the way you keep a tool casual when you are about to use it. "Something about the creek." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Cooper sat beside her left knee and looked at Douglas without interest. "The property has been appraised," Eleanor said. "The codicil your attorneys didn't know about has been filed. The bank account is transferred. The conservation easement is registered." She paused. "There's nothing here that needs your attention." Douglas's casual expression shifted, not into something ugly, but into something more honest, which was almost worse. "Eleanor," he said, "we were married for 39 years. I think we could—" "He called it worthless," Eleanor said. Douglas stopped. "You stood in a courtroom and you called it worthless." She said it without heat, the way you state a documented fact. "And you were welcome to think that. But I need you to understand I learned this winter that I was never the worthless one. It was never me." The silence that followed was complete. A red-winged blackbird called once from the creek bank. George continued leaning on the fence post without any change of expression. Douglas stood for a moment longer. Then he said quietly, "I hope you're well, Eleanor." And he turned and walked back to the Mercedes, and Clifford followed him without looking up from his phone, and the SUV reversed carefully back down the property road and turned onto the county road and was gone. Eleanor picked up the post driver. "Ready," she said to George. "Ready," he said. They finished the fence. Eleanor would learn through Gloria, several months later, that the renovation of the Pembroke Drive house had been halted by a notice from the city of Concord regarding a disputed right-of-way easement with the neighboring property, a legal matter concerning a shared driveway that had been informally maintained for decades and had never been formally resolved. The dispute had, by late fall, involved 3 separate attorneys and was projected to cost between $38,000 and $80,000 to resolve before any renovation permits could be issued. Douglas's business had contracted since the spring, down from 4 locations to 2. Eleanor heard this the way she heard most things now, with equanimity, as information that confirmed what she had already understood, that greed is only useful if you see the whole board, and Douglas had never been able to see past what he already had. She did not wish him harm. She did not think about him often. This was, she had decided, the most accurate form of justice available. By October 2023, the property at 1847 Old River Road looked different enough that Betty Wellett made the drive out from town to see it for herself, which Betty did not ordinarily do. The bus sat in the same place, but the area around it had been cleared and levelled, and a small cedar plank deck ran along its south side. George had helped with the framing, arriving one Saturday morning with lumber in his truck bed, and the manner of a man fulfilling an obvious obligation. The herb garden along the bus's east wall was Eleanor's, sage, flat-leaf parsley, and a rosemary she had coaxed through the first frost in a pot she brought inside each night. Sam Whitfield had come out twice more than the project required, and had taken to staying for dinner, which Eleanor made on the camping stove and which, by September, had become a proper two-burner propane range installed in the rear of the bus. The Beaver Creek Mill Foundation had been formally documented by the New Hampshire Division of Historical Resources in August. The site had been written up in the Concord Monitor and in a brief piece in the New England Historical Quarterly that Sam had coordinated. 2 historians from Plymouth State had come out with equipment and spent a weekend on the creek bank and had been, in Sam's word, ecstatic. The conservation easement payments had begun. The bank account was transferred and open.